I just went through a pretty major power outage a couple weeks ago. Was out of power for about a week and then out of internet for 8 days. So I thought what I would do today is to discuss a little bit about that experience, what I learned from it, what I found out about myself, and I think it reflects upon things that a lot of us might go through in similar kinds of situations. So, power's out Dharma coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So some of you will have heard of this tropical storm Isaias. It wasn't even a hurricane, it was a tropical storm, but as it powered up the east coast of the United States, it knocked out a lot of electricity to a lot of people. Many millions of people were really without power for a significant amount of time. Many of us, hundreds of thousands, for up to 7 days. I was one of the perhaps unlucky ones. And so during this time, it was a time that was, I think, an example of the Buddhist truth of anicca, of impermanence. That there's nothing we can really expect to be permanent, that there's lots of things that we want in this world, that we cling to, but that change. That's part of what it is to be in the universe, frankly. That's part of what it is to exist. So what I'll do here first is to go through what happened to me, the sort of experiences that I had, then some of the emotions as well, some of the things that I was reading at the time that I found helpful, and at the end, some of the practices that I found that were particularly useful to me during this time. Now, fortunately, and I'll be discussing some of the fortunate aspects of this all along the way, but fortunately, there really wasn't a lot of damage where I live or anywhere nearby. A few trees were down here and there. Of course, what happens generally is that the trees coming down knocks down the power lines, and if you have a lot of trees over a large area of a state, you can knock out power to a lot of people. And that's generally what happens in these kinds of situations. But near us, there really wasn't a lot. It would be great to show you photos of incredible amounts of damage, at least not great, because of course people would have suffered, but great in the sense of to you would have been more perhaps interesting, but there really wasn't. There were a couple of branches down here and there, but nothing particularly fascinating. Nevertheless, we were without power for a significant amount of time. And the human mind likes to cling. It likes to cling to things that it enjoys. So we'll know that during our lives, there's so much that comes through our senses that we find enjoyable. And most of it we aren't even aware of until it goes away. And then we're aware of how much we really do cling to these things. So for example, and here's one you may not have thought of, but hot water. I enjoy hot water for taking a shower in the morning, for being able to do dishes. Without power, of course, for us, there was no hot water. Our hot water heater is an electric one. So we had to make do with cold showers, which, for a couple of days is okay while the heat is retained, a little bit of heat is retained in the hot water heater, but then you're taking cold showers. You're having to wash things with cold water. Now, on the good side, we actually had water. Some of our neighbors were without water entirely. Fortunately, where we are, our neighborhood organization a year ago or so bought a generator for our well, and as a result, we did have water. But you can see how a very small difference in life, the lack of an electric power line, can make the difference between perhaps having water and not having water. It's an enormous difference. I enjoy also being able to be relatively cool during the day, not to have to put up with the heat and particularly the humidity of a mid-August kind of day. And while we're lucky around where I am or where we are, that these kinds of bad heat and humidity come really relatively rarely, and they come only in parts of the afternoon. Most of the day is relatively fine, but you don't have the option, for example, of let's say turning on an air conditioner. You don't have the option of getting a cool drink out of the refrigerator, of getting ice, because of course there is no cool air. All of our cool technology depends upon electricity. So it's something to consider. Of course, along with the lack of cool water and cool drinks and ice is a lack of refrigeration for food. And that's a big deal that many of you who have perhaps undergone power outages will be quite familiar with. That if a power outage can be okay for perhaps 24, 48 hours, the refrigerator will keep things relatively cool. The freezer may keep things frozen for a period of time, but once you get to 2, 3, 4, 5 days, a week, well, then you're going to lose food. Now, we were also fortunate in that one of our neighbors had a small generator that he used to power his freezer and refrigerator, and they had room for us to move stuff over, so we didn't lose everything. We lost some things, but we were relatively fortunate, once again. So another thing that we cling to is this ability to keep things cold, this ability to keep things refrigerated and frozen that we can use. So that we don't have to rely upon buying things at the grocery store fresh every day the way, frankly, our forebears used to have to do. And of course, I like to be able to do my work. And my work is largely dependent upon electricity and internet connection. Whether it's making videos, I mean, of course, you can see my camera. You can't see it, but my camera has a battery, but the battery is rechargeable and has to be recharged. And the internet connection that I use and the software that I use is also dependent upon electricity and dependent upon an internet connection. So that all had to go by the wayside as well, and that's why I had to take a week off of uploading videos, which is the first time I've had to do that in 3 years, basically, 2.5 years, because of this. It's been an experience which is really quite unique. I haven't had to do this before. And another thing that I tend to cling to and enjoy is relative quiet. One of the nice things about being out in the countryside is enjoying the quiet, that there's not a lot of noise around. You have the noise of animals, of crickets, of birds, but not much else in general. Some road noise, but that's about it. However, after, let's say, 24, 48 hours of a power outage, then neighbors begin to fire up their generators, their diesel generators. Generally, they truck them in from somewhere, they borrow them from somebody, they take them out of their garage. And if you've never been around a diesel generator, it's sort of, the sound is similar to a riding lawnmower. They're loud. And having to put up with that kind of noise, not only during the day, but all night long as well, is something that is not particularly enjoyable for those of us who like relative quiet. So you can see that these are all ways that a 7-day, a week power outage is something of a small trial. Now, let's be honest, I've known people who've gone through power outages that are much longer than this. In Hurricane Sandy, for example, that hit the northeast coast a few years ago. Friends of mine had power outages that lasted nearly a month, frankly, because that was a really very disastrous storm. And of course, many people as well had power outages and destruction of homes and property that were enormous. So in the scheme of things, this is of course a small example, but at least I think it is an example that I could learn from, and that perhaps you can as well. And all of this revealed to me my own shortcomings, the way that I'm, you could say, a bad Buddhist practitioner, the way that I wasn't living up to a lot of the things that I would love to be able to achieve for myself, of true calm. Now, I can say that for the first maybe day or two, there was calm, there was ease, because it was a new experience and there was something to be learned from that, and some curiosity that I could bring to bear to the situation, which made it more bearable. But after that, my own normal impulses began to kick in. I tend to be a person who is relatively impatient. I don't like putting up with things for long periods of time. And once we get to 48 and 72 hours and on, and we're not getting any kind of information from the power company about how long this is going to take. That was one of the issues that we had to put up with, is a lack of communication, frankly. I began to be aware of annoyances welling up from within myself, anger, senses of feeling injustice or feeling sorry for myself, this kind of clinging to the anger or clinging to the sadness or the pain that's involved with a particular situation. This is what the Buddha called the second arrow. We all have to put up with the first arrow of dukkha, of pains and sufferings in the world. They're just part of the human condition. But that second arrow is that identification with the suffering, that feeling of why me, of feeling why am I being singled out here, when obviously I'm not being singled out. I'm one of millions of people, but nevertheless there's this feeling of injustice that has to do with me. So that doesn't help either. So then what did help? Well, it was helpful to have, let's say one item of technology, a cell phone, because luckily, at least for us, there was cell service. Now it's spotty where we live. Without Wi-Fi, it's very spotty, so there's only particular parts of the house or particular parts of where we are that we can get decent service, and it's limited, so that was limited here, but we could go into town, we could get food, we could refill or recharge our cell phones and so on if we went into the town. Fortunately, again, we were lucky that the power was not out everywhere. It was only out in a spotty kind of situation, so that there were places that we could go to. And that, of course, made all the difference to us. It would have been much more difficult if we had not had that option. Also, I was reading a book that a neighbor gave to me a couple years ago, which it's called This Gulf of Fire, which is a book about the Great Lisbon earthquake of the mid-18th century, which is something that I had not known anything about. But this was an enormous earthquake that took place in one of the most wealthy and cosmopolitan cities of the day in the world. We don't think of Lisbon today as that kind of city, but it was back then. And in the middle of a clear, beautiful blue day in the fall, there was all of a sudden an earthquake that was something like over 9 on the Richter scale. The actual epicenter was probably out somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, but close enough that the city was almost entirely destroyed. There were 10 minutes of strong shaking that took down most of the churches and buildings of the city that were built, of course, of stone largely. And after that terrible shaking, there was a tsunami that then swept into the shore that caught a lot of people who had gone to the shore, gone by the shore to escape from the town, to escape from the falling stonework and everything. They were then carried off by the tsunami. And then after that, there were terrible fires that lasted for days and weeks. Fires started by cooking fires that had been left in houses, started by candles that had been left in houses and churches. This was, of course, a time before electricity, when literal fire was the way we did most things in life, many things in life. And so this was, of course, also a time before medical treatment of any kind that we would recognize today. And it was a terrible destruction. Fascinating in its way, but it was, to me, helpful to compare the mild kind of inconvenience that I had to go through with a real disaster. A disaster that really, frankly, we haven't seen in the last couple of centuries. It was worse, really, than the earthquake in San Francisco. It was the sort of thing that we saw, I believe it was in 2011, the tsunami out in Southeast Asia. So that was, I think, helpful to me to put things in perspective. And it was also a good distraction, because one of the things that the Buddha actually does recommend in one of his early suttas on dealing with troublesome thoughts that aren't very skillful, is at least for a time to consider distracting yourself. I did an earlier video on this. I'll put a link to it down below in the show notes. But while distraction is not, of course, a long-term solution here, if we're stuck in a particular situation where we're, let's say, frustrated or impatient, having something to take our minds off things, something that's a little bit more skillful, can be of use. Now, to me also, I found meditation, in particular, the very simplest forms of meditation, breathing meditation, focus on the breath, as being a very good way of reducing stress, because of course these situations are stressful. Some Buddhist scholars even translate dukkha as stress, because in a sense that's what it is. At least that's a great part of it. And simply to relax with a focus on the breath can be extremely useful. Another related practice is the practice of loving kindness, metta meditation, where we focus on the good aspects of people, where we focus on kindness towards people. That can help us to generate a feeling of generosity and of compassion for other people who are also suffering in the same situation, as well as gratitude for people who are helping out, because of course in all of this situation there was so much gratitude on our parts, on my part, for the people who are helping out in all respects, from our neighbors who gave us places where we could put our food, to local businesses who were also serving food or allowing us to recharge cell phones and so on, to the people, of course, from the power company who were repairing the damage that was done. Now, of course, we can hold that at the same time that we understand that perhaps people in positions of power at the power company, positions higher up, may not have prepared them well enough for this kind of situation, and that will need to also be taken into account now that the dangers are over. But meanwhile, there were an enormous number of linemen from the power company and from other companies from other states who came to help, and without them, none of this would have resolved. And this is, I think, a great example to all of us. It's an example that we can't go it alone, that going it alone is simply not a possibility unless we're literally going to retire into the forest and attempt to feed ourselves, which is not going to be a path for the vast majority of us. In any way, we couldn't all do it even if we wanted to. For the rest of us, the fact is we have to work together. That yes, we can do a lot by ourselves, but in the final analysis, the amount that we do by ourselves depends upon the work of hundreds, thousands, millions of other people. Even the great physicist Isaac Newton talked about the fact that he could see very far because he stood on the shoulders of giants, being the people who had come before him, who lifted him up off the ground and enabled him to see farther. And this is made, this interconnection of all of us is made all the more important when it comes to issues of weather and climate. And of course, the situation I went through with a relatively minor, frankly, tropical storm comes about because we're seeing more and more severe weather issues. We're seeing more and more severe storms around the world. And this comes up because of a heating of the environment, because of a heating of the atmosphere, putting more energy into the atmosphere, leading to bigger storms, more powerful storms, storms more often. And this is a way that I think we're going to have to work together even more in the future. And I did an earlier video as well about Buddhism and climate change and the way that the Buddha Dharma can inform our views of climate, and I'll put a link to it here up on the screen because I'd suggest taking a look at it next. Thanks so much to all my patrons over on Patreon, and thanks to all of you for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.